Hello and welcome back to How to Tank in MMOs. This is Ari Lillian, and today I'm going to go over the basic steps to tanking. The common misconception that players have about tanking is that tanks just run into the mobs and they grab aggro, and then that's it. And while the approach is definitely one way of doing it, it may or may not always work. For every group encounter, there are four basic steps that a tank performs. Good tanks and or natural tanks do these four steps instinctively and practically instantaneously. So, I mean, they don't really have to think about it. This is what they do. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to pinpoint why one tank is so much better than another. You kind of see that one is doing a really good job, but you can't really figure out why. And so here are the four steps. One is the prep, two is the pull, 3 is the grab, and 4 is the hold. And I'll explain each of those throughout this video. So let's talk about the prep. The prep consists of doing four things. 1 is activating your defensive buffs. 2, determining which mob or mobs you're going to pull. And then 3, figuring out where you're going to be tanking the mobs at. And 4, deciding if you're going to use crowd control, or CC for short. So let's talk about activating your buffs. It's easy enough, put your buffs on before you engage the fight. That's it. Step 2, figuring out which mobs you're going to pull and where you're going to be taking the mobs requires some kind of quick thinking, fast analysis, and a little bit of trial and error as you become familiar with the dungeon. Dungeon mobs usually consist of two types. There's linked pack mobs and single patrols, or pats for short. Linked mobs means that if you aggro one of them, the whole pack is coming after you. Usually link mobs, they remain stationary, they don't travel very far. Single patrols are typically not linked with large groups of mobs, but they'll move greater distances and will often go past multi-mob packs. So these are the guys that will be roaming, walking, going through the hallways. Often, these single patrols tend to be more powerful than the normal mobs, and they should be taken down individually whenever possible. My recommendation is to always take down the pats first, if you can, before engaging the packs. It eliminates the possibility that they're going to walk into your battle. Now, if the patrol is moving away from your team, then just go ahead and engage the packs, but maybe pull them away from the patrol's roaming area. We'll talk a little bit more about how to do this later on in the video. Once you've determined who you're going to pull, now you need to determine where you're going to tank the mobs at. And this is an important thing that new tanks tend to miss. I mean, the easiest and most preferred location is to kill them right where they're standing, and always go that route when you can. However, that route doesn't always work so well. In many situations, the mob can be too close to other mobs, and you may risk aggroing other packs that you're not ready to deal with, or the mobs may be in a very narrow area that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to dodge any kind of AoE attacks. In this situation, you need to pull them back to a safer location where you can kill them and appropriately deal with their mechanics. For example, in this pull here, we have a pack, a linked pack, with a patrol roaming through them. And so what I'm deciding to do is just to pull them back into the hallway that we've already cleared so that we can just handle the packs alone without having to deal with the patrol. And then lastly, you'll need to decide if you want to use crowd control. Now, different classes have abilities which allow them to take mobs out of the fight for a duration of time. These abilities include sleep, polymorph, immobilize, bind, freeze, charm, etc. In Final Fantasy XIV, sleep is pretty much the primary CC ability, although bards do have bind, but we don't use it as much. CC can be helpful if you're dealing with a very large pack of mobs that can inflict heavy damage on you, and it's particularly helpful if you know that your gear is not quite up to level where you can take that kind of beating. Just be aware that CC can be broken early if the mobs sustain any kind of damage whatsoever. So if you accidentally hit them, they're going to wake up, and your DPS will very likely break the CC early anyway, so plan on that. Now comes the issue of figuring out how to get the mobs to where you need them to be, and we'll discuss this next in the pull. The pull is your strategy of how to engage the mobs and get them to your ideal tanking location. There are three types of pulls that are typically used. One is you just charge in. 2, you pull them back, the pullback pull. And 3, the line of sight pull, also known as LOS. The charge in pull is simple enough. You just charge in head first and tank the mobs where they're standing. do this whenever it's smart to do so. It'll make the dungeons quicker, your group will like you better, etc. But be warned, most MMO games build mechanics into the dungeon to punish this type of pull if it's done blindly. Game designers, games, they know most tanks will just charge in and tank the mobs right where they're standing. And so they've built mechanics in to really upset that kind of pull. And so it's important that you pay attention to that. The pullback pull is also one that's commonly used to get the mobs to run toward you. You simply get into the range of the mobs, hit one of them with a range attack, and then run back to the location that you want to. So this is extremely helpful when you're trying to pull a patrol away from a pack or a pack away from a patrol area. Just a word of warning though, your DPS will think that just because you've hit the mobs once that you have aggro on all of them and they're just going to go buck nutty immediately before you even get them to where you're going to try to get them to. So it happens all the time. Don't worry about it. If you find yourself losing aggro during this process, it's not your fault. It's just your DPS being dumb. And so, yeah, you'll have to teach your DPS, well, can you just wait a moment while I get them to the location? Now, the one caveat with the pullback pull, pulling the mobs back to your location, is that it won't work with ranged mobs or casters. They're just going to nuke you as you run from where they're currently standing. For ranged mobs and casters, you need to do what is called the line of sight pull, or LOS for short. This is an amazing technique that unfortunately too few tanks use, but it's so effective. In order for a ranged attacker to hit its target, it has to have a direct line of sight. It has to see you. If there's anything obstructing the line of sight, like a rock or a building, the ranged attack can't be executed. So when ranged mobs lose their line of sight, they move forward towards their target to try to get them back into sight again. And tanks can use this to their advantage. By simply hiding around a corner or ducking behind a rock, tanks can force the ranged mobs to move toward them, and as a result, the mobs end up away from their initial location, and they're also all grouped up into a nice little cluster. This makes tanking them a lot easier versus running back and forth between all the ranged attackers as they're nuking you from different sides of the room. So some MMOs give tanks the ability to silence mobs for a few seconds. These abilities are extremely helpful in forcing casters to move into melee range. When I was tanking in WoW, the favorite ability that I had that I used all the time was the Blood Elf's racial ability, Arcane Torrent. It was an AoE silence that just pretty much silenced everyone within a nice radius for about a second or two, and it was just enough to force casters to come to me. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy XIV doesn't give tanks these kind of abilities. So if you're playing Final Fantasy XIV, you don't have that. But if you're playing another MMO, look for those kind of abilities. So now that you have all the mobs running to you, you need to do some fancy footwork to prevent them from going after your healer, which is what's going to happen the moment he or she starts healing you. So this next step is what I call the grab. It's important to know healing spells generate a lot of threat. I mean a lot of threat. And your primary objective at the start of each encounter is to ensure the mobs don't go after your healer, which is what they normally do. Your first step is to hit all the mobs with aggro generating abilities and do some kind of damage to them. That is what will grab their attention and will hold them initially to prevent them from going after your healers. In Final Fantasy XIV, the Paladin has Flash and Circle of Scorn, and the Warrior has Flash and Overpower. Flash is an AoE threat generator which inflicts mobs with blind, but it doesn't do any damage. It's helpful, it builds aggro, but it does no damage whatsoever. Fortunately, it doesn't have a cooldown other than the global cooldown, so it's an ability that can be spammed if needed. Overpower is a conal attack that does moderate damage, and Circle of Scorn is a radial attack that hits like a wet noodle. It just looks cooler, but that's really all it does. So yeah, use it though, you got it. It doesn't hit for much, but hey, it's something. On a side note, Warriors get Overpower at level 12, and Paladins don't get Circle of Scorn until level 50. It's a little annoying. When I tank as a Paladin, I'll use Flash once or twice when I first engage a pack. Then I'll do Circle of Scorn to do a little bit of damage, and then do Rage of Haloni once on all of the mobs before proceeding to the combo. So I actually hit all of the mobs at least once before I go forward to my 3-hit combo as a paladin. As I do the combo though, I'll tab through all the mobs to ensure that each one is struck with at least one threat generating ability, and that's specifically Savage Blade and Rage of Haloni. Just as a note, Fast Blade, which is the first attack of the combo, does damage, but it doesn't generate additional threat. And so if I hit a mob with Fast Blade, I'll also hit it again with Savage Blade before tabbing to the next mob. So now that you have the attention of all the mobs, the next step is just to turn them away from your party members so that the party doesn't get hit by any kind of conal attacks. The last part of tanking is just keeping aggro on the mobs while your team is beating down on them. And this is what I call the hold. At this point, tanking becomes a competition of keeping aggro on the mobs against your DPS and your healers. You need to generate enough threat on all of the mobs to prevent them from going after your healer, while at the same time generating enough threat on the 1 or 2 mobs that your DPS is pounding on. I found that the rotation I mentioned just previously is pretty good at holding aggro on multiple mobs, and if I find that I'm losing aggro on a specific mob, I'll use Flash again, target that mob, beat down on it a little bit more, use Provoke if necessary, etc. So it becomes just managing then the mobs. And that's pretty much the basic steps to tanking. It may seem like a lot, but once tanks become comfortable with these steps, they pretty much get executed in a matter of seconds, and you don't really even have to think about them much. So thanks for watching How to Tank at MMOs, and if you have any questions about the video or tanking in general, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Take care, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.